Well, welcome. It's 1 o'clock Pacific time, and I'm Drew Clark, CEO and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. We're here at the CalMatters Ideas Festival. So excited to welcome you back after our lunch for three 45-minute sessions on the continuation of the California Broadband Summit. This panel 2, we're calling it, is California's Pathbreaking Middle Mile program. And in just a moment, I'll introduce our moderator. But I want to, actually, before I do that, remind you to, we will take questions from those inside the room. So feel free to think of them and get the moderator's attention or my attention, and we'll make sure we bring a mic to you to ask questions from the room. And we also want to give a shout out to the sponsors of the California Broadband Summit, our diamond sponsor, AT&T, our gold sponsors, Tirana and Cal Broadband, and our silver sponsor, the California Emerging Technology Fund. This session's going to be on the Middle Mile program, which, as we heard this morning, came from SB 156, earmarked a $6 billion broadband investment to bridge the statewide digital divide, and a key portion of this was this Middle Mile program. But now Governor Gavin Newsom has proposed some cuts in those funds for Middle Mile. We're going to hear how California will adapt. Is the state still positioned to capitalize on its new Middle Mile network? How will the stakeholders navigate a new pathway? And we are ably led by Trish Kelly, the managing director of Valley Vision, which is a regional nonprofit civic leadership organization serving the Sacramento Capital Region. And Trish leads Valley Vision's broadband initiatives, including management of the Capital Area Broadband Consortium, the Capital Region Coalition for Digital Inclusion, and local government capacity building. Please join me in welcoming Trish Kelly and this panel this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Drew, and welcome everybody. We're really excited to have this continuation of this discussion, and also really excited to have the focus on this critical issue for us. As you all know, this has been an ongoing discussion and investment and initiative, as was emphasized this morning. But now we're in it, and so it's really important that we keep talking about how the implementation is going, what are our challenges and opportunities. And for us in the Capital Region, our consortium, the Connected Capital Area Broadband Consortium, is funded by the CPUC. It's one of the statewide network of consortia. So our mission is to help reach our unserved and underserved households and really just foster the overall connectivity, working with both our communities and our providers, as well as our partners and anchor institutions. So I'm delighted today to be able to facilitate this conversation, and I'd like to introduce first Mark Monroe.
All right, thank you very much. Can you hear me all right? So Mark Monroe, I'm the Deputy Director for the Middle Mile Broadband Initiative at CDT. I'm always excited to talk about our project. Kind of just going back to SB 156, we've heard mentioned, it was following, certainly after the pandemic, I think, the administration was looking for solutions for how do we get broadband out to everyone? How do what steps could be taken? And so a lot of things were being considered, and where we landed on was to come up with, to kind of break out the middle mile need from the last mile need. As everybody understands, last mile is where you get your internet. But trying to create a freeway to work along to get the network out to the communities that really needed it. And so the concept initially was, just a little background for me. We're going to be talking about budgets here in a bit. I come from 20 plus years in the Department of Finance, and so I'm kind of working in a range of policy areas. They included transportation, So the concept initially was, let's look at what's the state's middle mile need? Like, what would it take to follow the state's highway network? Nothing necessarily magic about following the highway network, other than that it is a route that the state owns, and we have Caltrans, and Caltrans could build. And so, kind of fast forward, we did SB 156. And it assigned some roles that I'll go through briefly, but there's been some subsequent movement of budget funding. We currently have about $3.87 billion. That's still about two-thirds the federal ARPA funding. But we have, $3.873 billion total. So when we talk about our budget for the statewide network, that's the amount that we're talking about. SB 156 directed CDT to work with the Public Utilities Commission to identify where those unserved and underserved communities were. This eventually, by the end of 2021, the Public Utilities Commission had put together a map. We worked with Golden State Net, our third-party administrator, to make sure that we were developing a network that was actually operational. And so about 2 years ago, we came out with a 10,000-plus mile map that was intended to reach all of the unserved communities that were identified. PUC went through a robust public process, a public proceeding to be able to get feedback and to decide where the network needed to go. And so since that time, we've been working, doing a lot of things at the same time. We heard discussions about permitting. We went to work on both the state and federal permitting level to try to streamline this. And some of the initial conversations were, well, how big is the project? How many projects are we talking about? And my theme is, it's one project and it's 10,000 miles. So you need to be ready to digest the project, according to that scope. So we've been able to reduce the permitting time, but from what I think Caltrans had originally estimated to be about 4 years to about 2 years. And so what we're going to be seeing throughout this year is kind of rolling out that pre-construction. Again, because of that, a lot of it's due to that permit streamlining and the fact that Caltrans has done some of this kind of work before. But some of the other things that we did at the same time, we went out to bid for construction to find out how much that construction would cost, would actually cost. Then we went out at the same time for bids on other partnerships. And we've now got secured about more than 6,500 miles of the partnerships with industry to help develop this network. Let's see, and so that's kind of where we get to today. So in doing all of that assessment and doing all of that work at the same time, last year we understood we needed another $1.5 billion to get to all of the places that we wanted to go. And so when it comes to what's in the budget now, we have, in January, last year the governor had said we want to be able to fund the whole project. And so in January, he was able to put $1.5 billion to get to all of the communities. But as we're all aware of the budget challenges, that $1.5 billion had to be taken out. I think there was a question earlier, does that come out of the base funding? So when I talk about the $3.8 billion, we still have that. This was on top of that. What was on top of that has been taken away. So now we at CDT will have to go through the process of deciding, okay, well, given the funding that we currently have, how will we best proceed? So is that a reasonable summary of 3 years?
I know that you have to condense a lot and give us a good context and overview, so thank you, Mark, and we'll get into the details as we get into our conversation. But now I'd like to introduce my good friend Barbara Hayes, who led economic development in the region before she went to RCRC.
Hi, everyone. So I don't know how I ended up on a panel about middle mile because I'm all about last mile, but we can't do last mile without middle mile. So you all that were here this morning heard Pat Blacklock, the CEO of Rural County Representatives of California, RCRC, that we created at RCRC a new entity, a joint powers authority representing 40 of the state's 58 counties. And it's called Golden State Connect Authority. And this was created at the strategic direction of the RCRC board specifically to help our rural counties, which include on one end of the spectrum, Sonoma and Monterey County, all the way down to the smallest of the counties in the state, Alpine County, with 1,200 residents throughout the entire county. So there's a big dichotomy or swing in the sophistication, capacity level associated with our member counties. So we created Golden State Connect Authority to provide assistance to those 40 member counties on accessing these program dollars as a way to crack the nut that is rural broadband, or the non-existence of rural broadband or broadband in rural California. So, and as was mentioned earlier, and I won't go into it, but rural California really takes the brunt of the lack of broadband infrastructure. When you look at the state as a whole, we are the least served areas and the hardest to serve, in all fairness, across the state. So with the creation of Golden State Connect Authority, we went to work right away in helping our member counties access those local agency technical assistance grants that Rob Osborne from the CPUC mentioned earlier. It was one of the 4 programs created under SB 156. And Golden State Connect Authority is managing 39 of those grants, representing 32 of our member counties and 7 cities therein. And we are doing so with the partnership of Tilson Technology and Utopia Fiber to develop network designs for those areas of those counties that include the unserved or underserved areas. So again, as Pat mentioned earlier, we are introducing a new model for broadband deployment in California, that of open access, last mile, municipal, fiber infrastructure. So our focus is on fiber, municipal, because we're a joint powers authority, a governmental entity, last mile, and that brings us to our partnership with the state. All of the 37 applications that we took those network designs under the LEDA program and developed FFA applications, FFA being the federal fund account, also one of the 4 programs under SB 156. We developed those applications, those network designs, specifically pointing to the state middle mile. This is a bold step that the state of California took with investing in open access middle mile, and we want to be supportive of that, number one. Number two, in all likelihood, it's probably, maybe not the only chance, that might be a little inflammatory, but it's a big part of how we are going to get into the reaches of the farthest, most corners where fiber makes sense. I do want to just circle back for a moment. I mentioned that we are an open access last mile fiber municipal network. We are only doing fiber. So that doesn't mean that we are doing it at the expense of fixed wireless. We're doing fiber as far and wide as fiber makes sense, makes financial sense, makes technological sense. We know we have scarce resources, so we're building or designing our infrastructure so that we build it in such a way that around the edges of our project areas, there's robust fiber connectivity for those fixed wireless solutions or other solutions to come off. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what your method of deployment is, everybody needs fiber. So there's that. Our focus is on fiber. Open access, as Pat mentioned earlier, open access means we will finance, construct, own, operate, maintain the infrastructure, and we will invite providers onto the network to compete for customers. But we can't do any of that without the state middle mile. So Mark has been both my friend and my enemy over the past 2 years. Actually, enemy is not the right word. It's not. He's never been my enemy. He's been at the other end of the phone and taken my wrath a few times, but as they've moved the middle mile hither and yon. But they have a big job ahead of them. And right now with those applications pending, and we're waiting on, as Pat mentioned, on the loan loss reserve restoration, I'm seated here on the stage, it kind of connotes the situation we're in. We're partners with the middle mile, and we're also partners with Tilson, and David's going to talk in a minute, but Tilson was supporting Golden State Net, the third-party administrator, early in the process. Tilson Technology is our consulting engineer on all of the LEDA grants. So the nice thing is we're now working cooperatively to figure out, okay, for our 37 plans, where makes the most sense for interconnection? Are there opportunities for joint build? I'm stealing David's thunder, but we're all working cooperatively to move forward the plans that we have for last mile, with the plans that have been developed with middle mile and what we have to work with, and seeing how we can do it for the lowest cost and and highest efficiencies.
Thank you, Barbara. And I think everybody knows and understands this is an incredibly complex undertaking. So the more partnerships we have and the more synergies across the different organizations, the sooner we hope we get to our goal and address our challenges as well. So now I'd like to introduce you, David, and if you could give us a background and, sort of you're the bridge too between.
Sure. My name is David Beaulieu. I'm with Tilson Technologies. Excuse me. It's a national telecom services provider. And as Barbara mentioned, we support both the MMBN through GSN, which is Golden State Network, and RCRC. Similar but separate efforts, I'll call them. And there was a lot of analogies made, which I agree with. One doesn't work without the other. That being said, the other issue is that there's a lot of moving parts constantly. So my perspective is primarily technical versus the funding, but of course the funding impacts, as Mark alluded to as well, now maybe decisions need to be made. But I guess the point I'm making is there's a constant shifting of not so much priorities, but priorities in terms of what network will be built and what, and the movements. So there's those influences that change the design of both networks. There are other influences, geographic, various reasons that the networks, shift, whether they be environmental, geographic, land rights issues that will, you start out with a network and it's primary, it's a preliminary network, and then eventually you massage it over time and you discover all of your challenges, you mitigate them. So ultimately, you have a solid design, but the issue is you have two fiber networks that have to talk to one another because one without the other obviously doesn't work. So that's kind of the role that Tilson is playing to some extent, being involved with both projects. We were able to have visibility and adjust, which we do daily. To make sure that these networks talk in the end. I think that's, so Trish just made a good point how the constant movement, which is not unusual in projects, but because of the scale and complexity of this one, it's a great challenge. I enjoy it. But there are, what was my point?
I'm glad you enjoy it. That's good.
Well, no, I actually do. I'm a crossroad type of guy. It'll come back to me.
Okay.
But
Well, I think, David, what you're making the point, all of you actually, is the need to connect all of the plannings and then you get into the engineering, the design, and then the build, right? So, Mark, from your standpoint, if you could give us just a quick update on where you think deployment is. I know in our region, we've had our jurisdictions beginning to come and tell us that there's an opportunity to locate the fiber huts, for instance, which is the beginning of the deployment for the middle mile. So we're really excited about that. We're telling our jurisdictions we need to get information to you, and they're coming through the applications too, the funding applications, but what are our priorities? So I want Barbara and David to address that part, but from your standpoint, how is the deployment coming now through the regions?
Well, I think at this point we have CDT has worked with Caltrans. So I'll kind of speak in two buckets. There's what Caltrans is building currently, based on the 10,000 mile network. That'd be approximately 4,000 miles. So Caltrans is doing their pre-construction. This is their permitting. This is their design work. This is all the things that normally would take 4 years, and they're trying to get done in 2, and that they are going to be rolling out this year. So I think of that, roughly 160 miles has been started around the state in various locations. So that's 160 miles that's already under construction. And then the other bucket are, you heard me mention the 6,500 miles of partnerships. Mm-hmm. And so we've got several hundred miles under construction there as well. Partnerships are a little, when we talk about Caltrans, we're talking about we've got a road, but we don't have any of the infrastructure there, right? We have to dig the ditch, we have to put in the conduit, the fiber, the vaults, the huts. We have to put it all together. When it comes to the partnerships, we have, I think more than I want to say a little more than 3,000 miles of IRU leases. They're also going to require a certain amount of construction involved, a certain amount of construction is involved in that, as well as some joint builds with some other companies. They're putting, we're sharing the cost of, well, they put their equipment in the ground, we put ours in the ground, and it saves everybody money. We have several hundred miles under construction there. I'm going to use this opportunity. I've got Shannon. He's our project delivery manager. So he's our numbers guy. He's, when things go from my paper or computer screen to actually being in the ground, it's because of Shannon and his team. And anybody who wants to know how to connect, he's the guy to talk to. Yeah, so we've got several hundred miles that those partners are working on as well. We are in construction. We're moving from, from the design and all the planning work that we've done to actually being in construction across the state. And, the private partners, just like Caltrans, they have permitting issues, they have design issues, right? It's not like I can just sign a contract and they're in the ground tomorrow. And I think everybody here understands that probably very well.
Thank you, Mark. So Barbara and then David, this emphasis on making sure that we optimize where the middle mile is going to meet our project priorities. Can you talk about that, even when, like your local area planning grants, how you tried to sync that process up?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, with our LADA grants, for each of those that we're managing, we designed it, or Tilson designed it to really, to point to that state middle mile, again, in support of this initiative. So all of the 37 applications that we submitted for FFA, all but one, and it's Nevada County, all but one are pointed to and supporting the state open access middle mile. The reason Nevada is out is because here's where he's not my foe, but he's my frenemy, is that in Nevada County, that middle mile kept moving and moving, and that was, the backdrop for that was the final filing deadline for FFA applications. And at one point, about 3 weeks before the FFA applications were done, the head of general services with whom I was working in Nevada County pulled the plug and said, nope, we're going with a known rather than an unknown. So we had to connect to an existing private sector middle mile and abandon that design plan to go with the state middle mile connectivity. But in all other cases, we've been on this wild ride with CDT, the Department of Technology, as they sign leases and then publish the maps, and the map swings the connection point off of Highway 101 over to a railroad trestle that, this is one of the phone calls Mark and I had, that's on the other side of a river, and now I got to deal with a railroad, potentially. So, by the way, Mark told me not to worry about it.
She's holding you.
Those weren't his
really
exact
up.
words, but I know that's what he wanted to say. Anyway, so that was during the actual application process. It was a very dynamic process, and my project manager from Tilson is in the room, and she will, if Elena's not nodding her head now, she will never nod her head. So it was dynamic, it was constantly changing. Once those applications were filed, though, it was locked in, and as you know, the state continued to issue their RFI last fall, RFI squared last fall, and again this spring. So we're at the point where I've just kind of given up really worrying too much about it, because it'll be what it'll be, and we'll figure it out. To David's point, it's we'll figure it out when we know what the final situation is. But at this point, I will say that working with the team at Golden State Net, with Tilson, with the middle mile folks, it's going to take a village to get this done. And thankfully, we are all kind of working together in that endeavor. And as I mentioned previously, we're looking now at opportunities, assuming that we're going to get our FFA application awards, or our applications awarded. We're looking at opportunities for joint builds. We're looking at opportunities where the huts, Trish, that you mentioned, perhaps a hut can be located on county-owned real estate and save the state some money and make it possible for the county to get lightning fast access. There are win-wins that we're exploring along the way.
So all of these issues are kind of what I was referring to collectively as things change constantly. And it's normal, but in this industry, and particularly a project at this scale, there'll be many changes to come, and we'll just deal with them the way we have. Everybody, you know, all the organizations work really, really well together. And but this does remind me of what I forgot the first time.
Okay.
So the analogy would be kind of like a mid-air refueling in a sense, where you have two very complex things, you know, in parallel, but at some point they do have to connect. And granted, they're constantly moving, which the projects are both moving in their own trajectory. That's kind of the way I see it. So, you know, I think we have, you know, two highly skilled pilots, if you will, and yeah. So I think in terms of progress, it's as good as I think it's going well. Maybe because I've been in this industry a very long time, so it's normal. But yeah, I'm optimistic.
And if I could add, I mean, one of the, you know, I think we talk about the federal deadline, right? And we have it, and the Public Utilities Commission has it for their FFA grants, right? That trying to do a 10,000-mile project in a few years, like this, that's aggressive. And I can say, as somebody was, you know, the time when Scott Adams and I were the team, there's not a lot of people that expected us to be where we're at right now. It's an aggressive time frame, and normally, you know, there's a way, you know, as I've talked with the folks in industry, they say, well, you kind of build out. You start at a point, and you kind of work. You know, you don't just do everything at the same time. We have to do everything at the same time because we had to have all the funding under contract by the end of this calendar year, and we had. In terms of that federal funding, we had that under contract by 15 months early, by the last year. So we've always, from the beginning, we had to sprint. We've been sprinting. We've had to do a lot of things simultaneously that you wouldn't normally do for a project if you had a normal amount of time. But a lot of things do have to be done at the same time, and so. We came out with our initial map based on the analysis of the Public Utilities Commission, just for order of magnitude here. Caltrans has about 15,000 miles of freeway, and our network was originally going to follow about 10,000 miles of that freeway. So it's pretty substantial. Now, when we went out and were able to find other partnerships that would allow the money to go further, and it would cost less than just building it on our own. There were some places, you know, we, as Barbara mentioned, the RFI squared. It's just a wonky term for how we went out to the industry and said, hey, how could we partner on this? We know what our end goal is, but what ideas do you have? And as we did that, we were eventually able to find 6,500 miles. But in some cases, right, we were trying to follow the highway initially because we thought Caltrans would build it. If we find somebody else who can do it for a substantial, I don't say savings, but it's going to cost less, and we can make the funding and the mileage therefore go further and reach those unserved populations. That we really wanted to do that, and so because of that, there were we still target the corridors, the freeway corridors. But as has been noted, sometimes we're on the wrong side of a track. Sometimes it's not as convenient. And so once those maps were updated, our maps are all on our website. But once they were updated, that did cause some pivoting, and it was inconvenient for people because some of the applicants. But we talk about the FFA grants, and we CDT we meet weekly, but more often than not daily with the Public Utilities Commission as they're kind of going through their processes. We really want to partner on these because, as has been noted, you got middle mile doesn't get you broadband. Last mile, you have to have that last mile connection, and so we're really trying to partner to make sure that what we pull together delivers.
Thank you, Mark. And I'd like to note that we've talked about FFA and BEAD, but also there is the ongoing California Advanced Services Fund. Bob might have mentioned it. There's an ongoing fund. It's not as much money, but it's made to be an ongoing resource for us over the next 10 years, too, for the last mile. So that ongoing planning, the maps are different for the different funding sources. CASIF does allow some fixed wireless and not just fiber. So in the communities, we're all trying to look at these options as well and make sure we're coordinating and appreciate the partnerships with the state agencies and RCRC and others. So one other thing I do want to highlight is the need for the permit streamlining. It was mentioned this morning. We are working with the state. The state has a guide. The feds have a guide. We've developed a guide with California Emerging Technology Fund. So it's really important that at all levels of government, including local government, that we're getting our project readiness. And David, maybe you can address that, and then I think Drew is going to help us with some audience questions.
Yeah, so it's a great point. As Mark mentioned, there are portions of the network that wasn't anticipated initially that they would be outside the highway system, but they in fact are via the partner's existing infrastructure. So therefore, there's work that happens pretty much in any jurisdictional permitting realm that you can imagine, whether it be federal, state, county, local. So those are things like Trish mentioned. I think Mark also mentioned there's some streamlining that was done in advance at certain levels, but ultimately when you get down to the backyard of the individual you're submitting the jurisdiction, the agency, there'll be that, all of those layers and then the local requirements as well. So that's one of the services that we provide is wherever we have to go, that's what we will do. And there's, various types of permitting that can be required, environmental, jurisdictional. There's all kinds of layers of permitting, but yeah, that's one of the engineering part is fairly simple, fairly straightforward, because again, we're building a core network, a fiber network, and an access network, and they just have to be contiguous from customer to the web, if you will. It's all the permitting and all the details in between, and that's all that constant adjusting and modification to the plans, the designs, backpedaling. So this is daily. So this project, I've been on some fairly significantly large infrastructure projects in my career. This one is probably has the most pieces to it, but it's been fun.
And we all have a role, and David has an unusual definition of fun. So with that, I'm going to turn it to Drew.
Well, it's to whoever has questions. We brought a mic down to, don't be shy. If you've got questions, raise your hand. Here we go.
Hi, David Fine from the Santa Ynez Band of Chumash Indians. And Mr. Monroe, we're very concerned about that leg of the middle mile that comes down through Santa Barbara County and right to us. We have several grants in to build fiber to the premises for the reservation and the other tribal land, and maybe expand into the underserved neighborhoods north of us. But if that middle mile doesn't come, we won't be able to do anything. So the question is there an update yet to that map, considering that 1.86 billion is gone? And follow up to that, was that the phase 2 part that at one time we were in phase 2? So I'm just trying to figure out what we're going to do and how we can do it. And I may have a third part, depending on what he says.
Okay.
All right. Great question. So let's see. You mentioned the phased approach. It was something that we had originally come up with a year ago to trying to use the information we had to get within 5 miles of most of the unserved communities. We have backed away from that, and what we're in terms of the funding challenge now that we're experiencing with the budget. We are, that's, I would argue that's really our highest priority in terms of when you talk about the FFA grants. And so, obviously we want to be able to reach all of the unserved throughout the state. But of the almost 500 FFA grants that were submitted, I think 107 have indicated that their intent to tie to the middle mile broadband project, to CDT's project. So in terms of those projects, if those projects are planning on tying to the middle mile, we are working with the Public Utilities Commission as we start to think about, okay, well, given less funding, how do we best approach this? But that's going to be one of our key priorities, is that we know that there are 107 applications, and again, I mean, those are applications, but there are 107 of them that have said that they tie to the network, and so that would really be, that's one of my highest priorities, is to be able to reach those locations.
Great. We have another questioner back here, so. Here you go.
Ian Scott, Yuba County. This question is for Mr. Monroe as well. We're one of the jurisdictions that ended up having a change in the location of our middle mile, which may have had an effect on our project. So I was just wondering, in the context of the budget issue, what the notification process will look like to locals on any further changes to the map associated with the budget issue.
Yes. So we learned about the budget challenge in the real time with everybody else a few weeks ago. And so I think we broadly want to be able to talk through the criteria, such as the FFA grants, and kind of talk through how we want to approach this, but we're still kind of working on that. And so we, obviously we have our middle mile advisory committees. Our next one's end of July. And then we'll have another one in October. We also do stakeholder engagements in between those, so those are two opportunities. But we're just starting this process of going through and trying to see, okay, with the existing funding, how do we get to all of those 107 FFA grant locations that have said they'd use our network? And I believe you're saying your project would tie to the network. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's. That is a process we're trying to go through right now, is, again, trying to reach those.
A question right here.
Drew, thank you. And this is also to Mr. Monroe, but I try to be really careful about which hat I'm wearing. So to be very transparent, I'm switching hats from my Toronto Wireless hat, which focuses on the euphemism of last mile, to my civic service hat as chair of the California Transportation Commission and a commissioner the last 18 years on middle mile. As you know, we're one of the 5 state entities in the governor's executive order on broadband for all. And in June, members of your team are coming before us. So mine is on timing and on permitting. Higher? Thank you. Mine is on timing and permitting. How can we all be working together, because time is money and time to deployment matters so much, and the permitting process, so that as state agencies and entities working together, we can get the middle mile done so that we can get the last mile connections done and serve 1,614,000 Californians.
Okay, I'm sorry, permitting, and what was the first one?
Timing.
Timing, okay. So, again, this does go back to, we've been given new budget parameters, and so we have to be able to make those decisions. The federal timeline to be done with the work is December of 2026. And so in terms of timing, we back everything up from December of 2026. And so our intent is to get started on any segment as quickly as possible. So one of the things you will have seen if you watch the Middle Mile Advisory Committee meetings is Caltrans provides regular updates as to how many miles they'll get done. They plan to get done in any quarter, and they're kind of they're not specific miles of this segment here necessarily. It's more looking at overall where they stand. But we expect to start construction on any of the Caltrans constructed segments by the end of this calendar year. And we expect all of our partners and the Caltrans construction to all be done by December 31st of 2026. What I'll also say is that because of some of the partnerships we have, some of the leases where they're still pulling fiber for us, but they're gonna actually be ready to provide service We expect some service to be ready in the latter half of next year. Again, more than a year ahead of schedule for some of those projects, right? Because they already have a lot of the infrastructure, most of the infrastructure in the ground, and we're just adding to it. So in terms of timing, does that kind of help a bit? And then in terms of the permitting, the SB 156 kind of provided for some permit streamlining for the state. And so the state we are where we're at right now with Caltrans and with being able to move the project forward because a lot of that, because of some of the CEQA improvements that were included there. And again, because of the broad programmatic effort that we started back in early 2022 to really get those permits moving forward. I think my understanding is that the state level is more, it presents different challenges, we'll say, than perhaps the local level. But I know that, Scott Adams was here earlier from the Office of Broadband and Digital Literacy, and I think they had partnered with GoBiz to put together a permitting playbook. I think Scott might have referenced earlier. And I think those are the key things for any of the components that are off of the state highway system. But we're still going to need, when we talk about a lot of the construction that has to happen on, even by our partners, right? If Caltrans isn't building it, if it's following on Caltrans right away, there's still permitting help that we will need from Caltrans for our partners to be able to build.
Yeah. Can I mention one quick thing before we leave the timing, having to do, and it was mentioned at the first panel, and again, kind of relative to your middle mile and the timing and the money must be encumbered by and spent by, it's important to note that over the last 2 budget cycles relative to the FFA last mile and previously the loan loss reserve, hopefully it'll get restored, but is that they've washed the federal identity out of those pots to a large degree. So of the $2 billion in the FFA, only $550 million of federal rescue plan dollars, which was the original source of funds, remains. The rest of those dollars are general fund dollars. And then loan loss reserve, well, it also was washed, so it was general fund dollars. So in terms of the deadlines, I think, of course, everybody would like to still stick with those deadlines and hurry up and get the work done, because ultimately it's about connections. But for FFA, it's important to know that the majority of those dollars are no longer federal dollars. So it started out as all of the programs in SB 156 were funded out of, they got washed out and pushed into other programs during budget cycles.
I'll put on my finance hat and explain this.
Yeah.
But when the federal ARPA funding came out, it was for a range of infrastructure, right? We could have used it all on, I think roads, but there's a range of infrastructure that it could have been spent on. And so this goes back to the fact that the state, because of the work of the Broadband Council and all of the work that Scott Adams and his team and the Public Utilities Commission, we were actually ready to say, hey, if we've got a bunch of federal funds coming through ARPA, we can actually put them towards this broadband effort. And so what Barbara's talking about is, there was initially our program was all federal ARPA funds, right? So when Finance comes through and does the budget, and they're saying, well, we've got federal ARPA funds over here on broadband, but we could put it over here on this other project and then just backfill it with general fund. That's really all she's talking about, is that there's some ways you move funding around. The state's still getting the same amount of money. It's still building this, getting the same amount of benefit, but how it gets funded depends on the budget that finance and administration are building at the time.
Go ahead, Joy.
I'll go ahead and speak anyway.
Joy, could you say who you are, please? Introduce yourself.
Joy Sterling, Sonoma County.
State Ag Board. State Ag Board Broadband Champion.
Many hats. So at this point, is there any section of the middle mile that is on the chopping block?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, okay, so she's asking if at this point are there any sections of the middle mile that are on the chopping block? And so I will say none have been identified. but we identified that we need $1.5 billion more to get to the full 10,000. If we don't get the $1.5 billion as is currently proposed in the budget, then yes, we don't know exactly where. We're still trying to go through that analysis, see where the FFA grants are, see where, what our options are. But yes, there's going to, presumably we're not going to be able to reach all 10,000 miles without the additional funding.
And is there a way that that decision can be made so it doesn't all fall on the shoulders of rural areas?
Joy asked if it could be done so it doesn't all fall on the shoulder of rural. And I'll say, as kind of closing, thank you, Joy, for the questions, and everybody. We all have to keep advocating for the investments in this critical infrastructure. And the next panel is going to talk about the cost to build. So we all have a job to do, and partly that includes, advocating and educating future legislatures. Barbara and I talked about that, and you heard Patrick this morning talk about funding cycles. So there will be up cycles again, and we need to do the long-term planning too to make sure we get this done. So quickly, I want to just give you each 30 seconds closing words, and then we're on to the next panel.
All right. In answer to your question, yes, that is a high priority for us, is that, that we find a good way to distribute whatever we have to do and really target, again, I mentioned the FFA grants, that's really key. I actually want to introduce Ben Polsky. He's our business manager. When it comes to connecting to our network, on the business side, and certainly any services you even think you might be interested in, please talk with Ben. Hong here, I believe, is joining him. So that's one thing I would want to do. And then in terms of the mechanical side, I would like to point you to Shannon. But no, we really appreciate the opportunity to come here and be able to talk about the project. It's, we just want people to understand that, a lot of, we had to do a lot early on to get to where we're at, and we're in a really good place. But we now have some tough decisions ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Barbara.
I would just kind of double down on what Mark said, in the sense that we all were, heralded July of 2020 when SB 156 passed as an historic moment in California relative to broadband infrastructure. I would argue that right now, today, as we sit here, we're sitting at the same spot, in the sense that the state has made this huge investment in middle mile, and we're sitting on the precipice of a budget where they're actually redlining broadband investment out. And I know there are a lot of priorities, but this is truly an investment in the state's future, and it's important. So I would just say, yes, there are hard decisions to be made. I'm not an elected official, and there's a reason for that, but we need to keep on our elected officials and make sure that they know how important this is. And my constituency is rural California. It's so important to rural California, but other areas as well.
Thank you, Barbara.
I will comment also regarding your question as to the potential that some portion of the network may be higher priority than others. To some extent, it's in addition to budget, obviously, the structure of the network itself. There's a core network, which is the middle mile, but even within the core network, there's a core ring, if you will, and then there's subtending rings. So, to build the most you can for the same amount of money, you would focus on the core ring, because without the core ring, the subtending rings don't operate. So I guess all I'm getting at is it's not a purely financial or otherwise decision. It takes a lot of things into account, one of which is the technical parameters and limitations.
Thank you so much, and please thank our panelists.
Thank you so much, Trish, for leading that discussion. And we'll go ahead and invite our panelists to exit the stage. While they do so, I'm just going to say a word or two about our third panel that's coming up.